Welcome to part 2 of being stuck in an apartment without a camera. For today, we have the second part of our video from yesterday. Yesterday we looked at our recap for Mythic Plus. Today we look at our recap for the raid. Now, there is something a little bit more shiny to look at for today, because in just 7 days, when 10.1.5 launches, we don't just get the balance tuning to check out, how things are changing in the raid with the buffs to the mage specs, the buffs to the warlock specs, the changes to balance druid, to enhancement shaman, etc. We also get Augmentation Evoker going live. Perhaps something that went a little bit under the radar, but in just a few days we will have a new spec coming in the raid. And it's gonna be quite interesting because this spec's entire goal is to buff other DPS specs. We have seen how much impact in the meta can Power Infusion have. And that's just one ability. We have seen in the past certain specs like Fire Mage at times, Destruction Warlock or Demo Warlock or Unholy Death Knight at times being the beneficiaries of Power Infusion and gaining much more power, a much higher power, and make them climb the rankings of the better DPS specs in the raid just because of Power Infusion. So who knows what's gonna happen once Augmentation makes it to live. If certain specs will be benefiting a lot from Augmentation and the meta will change purely because of the addition of this new spec. Now, before we go a little bit more in detail into that, we have to look at how things are going in general. Since we haven't checked out the raid in a couple of weeks by now, this is the current situation in the raid. Compared to the last time we looked at this, there is a first clear change, which is warriors. Now we have both arms and fury, with arms being ahead, rising by quite a few positions compared to the last time we looked at this. Conversely, there is a fall, and this time the fall is for rogue specs, in particular of outlaw, which is now fallen down by quite a lot compared to a couple of weeks ago. There are other specs that have not really changed, unfortunately. Specs like Feral Druid, Balance Druid, specs like Havoc Demon Hunter and Marksmanship Hunter, as well as Beast Mastery Hunter, they are all comfortably chilling at the bottom. We have seen some buffs. We have seen both of the Hunter specs, the ranged Hunter specs, receiving buffs recently. So far, doesn't look like it has changed too much. We have also seen Havoc Demon Hunter getting its single target buffed. For now, doesn't seem to have had too much of an impact in the raid. It might be a bit sad for arcane mages and even fire mages that just as they start to do well, just as they start to show up quite high in the rankings, they are about to receive quite a lot of changes to their spec and class as a whole in 10.1.5. Now, not to mean that Arcane and Fire Mage are being nerfed in 10.1.5, it's just that, maybe perhaps the changes in the patch are going to make the spec overall less powerful at the moment. Doesn't look like, in particular for Fire Mage, with the changes coming in the patch. It's also going to be interesting to see what's going to happen with the changes to the Warlock specs, especially because at the moment Demonology has been one of the better performers in the raid, so we will see with 10.1.5's changes if that is going to be benefiting Demo. Same goes for the other two Warlock specs getting buffed in 10.1.5. Also, same goes for Balance. Balance is a spec doing quite badly in the raid, despite being quite popular. As usual, Balance Druid, regardless of its power in the raid, remains quite the popular pick. We will see how it's gonna do with the changes coming in 10.1.5. You can also look at the damage done to bosses, the single target focused rankings. In here you start to see some similarities, like for example Arcane Mage and Unholy and Demo are still towards the top, meaning that for them it's not really going to change too much whether or not it's a single target fight or an AoE fight. They can still continue to perform very well. Meanwhile, other specs are much more diverse, like for example Assassination, which is generally towards the bottom of the meters, but as soon as you look at single target, Assassination is now the fourth better performing spec. As far as popularity goes, we continue to have quite the large gap from the first spec being Retribution and the rest. If you look at the difference, Ret is almost 20% ahead of the second most popular spec, which is Shadow Priest. And we continue to have interesting situations based on what is required in a raid. For example, we continue to see Havoc being very popular and Balanced Druid being very popular, despite them not being too strong. Why is that? Well, Vengeance Demon Hunter might be meta in Mythic Plus, but not really in the raid, which means you still need a debuff for the Demon Hunter to be brought in the raid, so Havoc will remain popular, even though it's doing poorly. Same goes for Balanced Druid. At the moment, Feral Druid is not very popular, Guardian Druid in the raid is the least popular tank, together with Prot Warrior, so either you bring a Resto Druid for the Mark of the Wild buff, or you bring a Balanced Druid. That is what is generally going to continue to keep Balanced Druid a quite popular spec in the raid, despite their performance somewhat lagging behind ever since the days of Shadowlands and their Ventier Ravenous Frenzy build, which was very strong. Ever since then, they have never been nearly as strong, but still very popular in the raid. It will also be interesting to see the changes that will come for Balanced Druid in 10.1.5, if they will be able to improve the state of Balanced Druid a little bit when it comes to the raid performance. You can also better see the performance throughout the season while looking at the graph over time. You can see that, for example, the mages have changed a lot. We started with Fire Mage being the worst performing spec in the raid up until the end of May for the first 3 weeks or so of the raid, and now it went all the way up to being the 4th better performing one. Same treatment for Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage was just chilling in the middle of the pack, far below the top 5 specs, and then over time it went all the way up to being the better performing spec. Those are pretty much the two highlights when it comes to the range DPS, these two mage specs doing better. The other range specs haven't really gone up or down by a lot over time, they have mostly stayed around the same level of performance. And then we can say somewhat similar things for the melee DPS. So first we have this weird ass spike of Frost Decay, who started very low and then out of nowhere just went like crazy, stayed crazy for quite a bit, and then now it's sort of evened out a little bit more, even though it's still quite high in terms of performance. Same goes for Unholy, which was far lower down in the first 3 or so resets of the raid, and then went all the way up and consolidated itself towards the top. Another spike up has been done by Assassination. As you can see here, it was much lower down before, and all of a sudden there is a clear spike of Assassination out of the start of June. We can also see Warriors, in particular Arms, which started as the clear worst spec, and then similar to Assassination, around the same time went all the way up as being the 3rd better performing one. Not really any other things changing for the bottom specs. You can see Havoc and Enhancement and Windwalker, which started rather low and continued to somewhat, fly rather low. Enhancement had a little bit of a growth, but in the end it still stays more or less here. The only other change is Ret, and this time is in the negative. Ret was as opposite to Warrior and Frost Decay and Unholy Decay. Ret was the one that was starting very high, stayed very high, remained high for quite a bit, and then it started slowly plateauing and going slightly down over time. Those are the main changes when it comes to the melee DPS performance throughout this season. Nothing really much to go over when we are talking about healers. When you're talking about the healing performance of the healers, you can see that throughout the season, the major change is the initial idea that Resto Shaman was very strong, coming from the end of season 1, where they were topping the meters every time, and then as soon as most of the healers got hands on their tier sets, Resto Shaman, went much lower down, as opposed to Resto Druid and Evoker, which just went higher and higher. That's the main progression that happened when it comes to healers in this season of the raid. Popularity is still the same. We still see a gigantic gap from Holy Priest to the rest of the healers. All of these 4 healers are quite close to each other in popularity. The bottom 2 are much lower down, and then Holy Priest has a significant gap ahead of the rest. this has stayed more or less the same for the past few weeks in the raid. Always interesting also, of course, to check things like tier lists and rankings, like from sites like Subcreation or even u.gg, in how the specs are performing. There is quite a good amount of overlap in the rankings. In here you see Devastation, Shadow, Ret, and Demo. In here you see Devastation, Shadow, Demo, and Unholy instead of Ret, which is one tier below, and here Arcane is one tier ahead of u.gg, but you know, they still remain more or less the same, even the bottom ones with Frost, Affliction, Survival, and Feral, you know, Frost, Affliction, Survival, and Feral. So we do have more or less the same ideas about how specs are performing. Perhaps the main difference comes with healers, where one tier list puts Holy Priest at first, and then Holy Paladin and Resto Druid, whereas this one puts Holy Priest and Resto Druid at first, Preservation Evoker lower down, and then Holy Paladin even further below. But you know, it's much less objective and much more subjective how the healers are performing in the raid rather than the DPS. What is going to be more interesting, as we pointed out at the start of this video, is wondering what is going to change in here, not just because of the balance tuning. We already know that Arcane is going to change, Fire, Frost, Demo, Affliction, Destruction, Balance Druid is also going to change. So these we can already expect some changes in the meta, in the power of these specs because of their balance tuning. What other thing might change the state of certain specs is going to be Augmentation Evoker, of course. Is it going to be much more beneficial for certain specs to be buffed by Augmentation Evoker? Certain buffs like giving certain specs 3% more crit, certain buffs like giving specs a chance to duplicate their attacks at 15% effectiveness. Of course, the Ebon Might buff, giving them some 2000 primary stat as a buff. That is going to be very powerful of an increase in damage, and maybe it might change the power of certain specs. Now, Blizzard has changed the way the power is going to be shown in the meters at the very least, whereas for Power Infusion, all of the benefit goes on the player who receives Power Infusion. So you, as a priest, won't really see the damage you did with Power Infusion because it goes on the, you know, on the Unholy DK who receives it. When it comes to Augmentation, there is quite a good amount of these procs and damage effects and extra damage, which even if it is procced by another player, it will still going to count as your damage, not as his damage. This is going to be more similar to something like the Blessing of Summer of a Holy Paladin, where the damage of Blessing of Summer goes directly to the Paladin and not to the player that is being casted on. Still though, a few of these buffs, like the stat buffs, the primary stat and the secondary stat buffs, for example, are still going to be going to empower the specs that they benefit from this buff. So it's going to be interesting to see, for example, if there's going to be some meta where players will have to play around, and I'm talking about literally playing around, playing next to the Augmentation Evoker. So every time the Evoker casts Ebon Might, it's going to go to specific specs. Specs who have their cooldowns ready, for example. Specs who are about to use their Army of the Dead, Dark Transformation, their ghouls, their gargoyles, or their tyrants, etc., etc. They move next to the Augmentation Evoker, who is going to grant them the Ebon Might buff, for example. Or if the buffs given by Augmentation Evoker will be not big enough for you to be wanting to min-max to this level, right? Maybe the playstyle of Augmentation will be just cast Ebon Might when it's ready. You know, whoever is closest to you will get the buff. Whatever, we're not gonna min-max this thing because it doesn't give us enough power. Or maybe it's going to be very important to actually play around these buffs given by Augmentation because they will be very, very powerful. As I said, this is going to be, of course, much more important in the raid than in Mythic Plus, mostly because, you know, there are more players in a raid. You can have more Augmentation Evokers in a raid buffing multiple players. So, of course, the power of Augmentation will have a bigger effect in a raid encounter compared to Mythic Plus. There are still, of course, voices in the corridors and rumors about Augmentation becoming the new mandatory spec, one for Mythic Plus and a couple of Augmentation Evokers for each raid. We will see, we only have 7 days left before we actually get to see how things are going to shape up once Augmentation goes live. I am still a little bit iffy on the balancing, on the tuning of this spec and how Blizzard will manage to turn it into a situation where you can decide to not use an Augmentation Evoker and not feel forced to not use one. It feels like if that is ever the case, then the spec will just be too weak, then nobody will want to play the spec. It feels like to make Augmentation Evoker a wanted spec in the raid, you will actually have to make them quite powerful, to the point where it's just not a good idea to not have at least one in the raid. That is what it feels like right now, even after the nerfs, the several nerfs given to Augmentation Evoker. It still feels like it will be a somewhat mandatory spec for the raid, for the damage increase you will be able to gain with an Augmentation Evoker. But hey, at least looking at the glass half full, we will have something like 2 or 3 months before Season 3 goes live. So Blizzard will have plenty of time to tune and to test Augmentation in the second part of this season before we actually get into Season 3, hoping that by that point the spec will be more finely tuned and more finely balanced. But for now, this is what we have in the last week of the raid before the release of 10.1.5. As mentioned, we have looked at the specs doing well right now and performing well right now, and now all there is left to look at is to wait for the release of the patch and see just how effective the changes to many of the specs will be in the raid. We have, of course, the focus on the specs that will be changed the most. So we have Guardian Druid for tanks, we have Holy Paladin for healers, we have Enhancement Shaman for the melee DPS, and then we have the mages, the warlocks, and Balanced Druid for the ranged DPS, with also the addition, the implementation of Augmentation as a new ranged spec. So besides this, now all there is left to do is wait for the release of the patch. So we are done for today with this last recap of the raid situation in 10.1 before the release of 10.1.5. With this out of the way, we are thanking, of course, first all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still, as usual, support for free, though. You can like and comment down below to help cheat the YouTube algorithm, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. With these helpful things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I just hope Augmentation won't be broken OP. And we will have to see like 3 of them in every raid, with the DPS constantly bitching about who is getting the buffs of Augmentation. Please, let's not make that happen.